Okay, we are live.
There's a real wrong and a real right.
I think everyone does know that God existed, assuming you do.
Simply because they don't want.
I think the answer is actually kind of already in the question there.
We are the Mentionables.
And welcome to the most mentionable show on the internet, The Mentionable. Tonight, we dive in on all things nerdy, as we kind of typically do. Specifically, though, we're going to talk a little bit about transhumanism, technology, impact on apologetics. So that's on the agenda, but we can also take your questions. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to throw them in chat. We would love to hear from you on either YouTube or Facebook. So be part of this conversation with us. I'm Caleb Johnston. With me tonight, to my right,
Joel Furchess.
And here holding both of us up,
I am Atlas. I'm Clinton Wilcox.
Glad to have you both with us tonight.
Actually, coming from my new location in Las Cruces, New Mexico. So I've finished the move, but I'm still kind of in the middle of setting everything up. So
I was going to say your office looks exactly the same.
Not exactly. There's a different background than I had last time, but
there was a window behind him, and now the window's to the side.
Yeah.
I don't have any windows in.
Ceilings and
I actually don't have any windows in here. That cooler behind me actually used to be a window, but they had a cooler installed. So
what's in the frame above it?
That's a picture, actually.
I figured as much.
Mm-hmm. I've got a couple bookshelves behind me. Eventually I want to get them a little bit better in frame. You can kind of see the one right back here, and then I've got like one right back here, but it's facing sideways. So,
and this
what's in the picture? Dang it!
What's that?
What's in the picture?
It's just an ocean scene with like some rocks.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Some rocks.
Can continue now.
Yeah,
and this is why we are the most mentionable show on the internet, right here.
Yeah.
So, I dubbed this the Nerdcast, the Apologetics Nerdcast, because we dabble into topics that are rather nerdy, especially for an apologetics podcast or a live stream, whatever you want to call it. So, we've dove down some pretty deep rabbit trails with Star Trek and aliens and different things in the past. Go check out some of those episodes. But so I figure why not? We didn't have a subject plan. We just dub it the Nerdcast and see where it goes. For me this week, I've kind of been beginning some thought roads down into transhumanism, though. Specifically, I've just been thinking a lot about what the future will look like for humanity. I nerded out this week and picked up a Oculus Quest 2. And to see how far VR has come in my lifetime is absolutely ridiculous. So that got me thinking about it. And then there was also this news clip that popped up. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but for Elon Musk, Neuralink company, they did a video demonstrating how they could take a monkey and they taught it to play Pong on the computer. But with the Neuralink, which is a chip implant they do in the brain that actually picks up signals, reads them, and converts them into action, they were actually able to have this monkey play Pong with just its brain, which was pretty amazing. But I know a lot of Christians have great concerns about what we would dub transhumanism and kind of some of these things coming down the road. And, we can lump virtual reality into the same kind of thing. Not really transhumanism unless you upload consciousness, but...
Yeah, transhumanism is really more about humans uploading a consciousness into an artificial intelligence. It's right there in the name, transhumanism, trans meaning across, and then human across into an artificial body or something. So
Sure. So that's the kind of, ultimate end of transhumanism. But I believe the term refers to any kind of evolutionary leap that involves integrating humanism with mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
So bringing technology, so
all of that
talk about, upgrading your body, for instance, with it's the Borg. The Borg is transhumanism. Nerd reference of the night.
Yeah.
I was going to give you a sample of how far VR had come. Let me share my screen. This is the best of VR back a couple of years ago after the commercial. They better pay us for playing that.
I know, right? We need to get some kind of royalty.
There we go. Pretty cool. Look at those graphics.
So impressive.
I know,
who would have thought? Right. And yet now, we have affordable VR headsets that, I'm sure price will continue dropping down on things. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're already cheaper than cell phones. So,
yeah, that's just the nature of technology.
I'm the guy with the little tear in my eye looking at VR technology developing, knowing I can't ever be part of it because I'm blind in one eye. And I did try a VR headset at one point, and it really messed with my head and made my vision go wonky. And because you can't do it apparently if you're only partially sighted in one eye.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah.
I'm sure they'll have a fix eventually. Either that or you'll have to get a robot eye.
Transhumanism.
There's your solution right now. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, Clinton, can you maybe introduce us to, you're a bioethicist, so could you introduce us to maybe some of the ethical problems associated with going down kind of the transhumanist road?
Well, sure. Yeah. Certain things can be lumped under the transhumanism umbrella, like, bionic implants and things like that. But kind of the end result of transhumanism is really born out of the human fear of death, especially if you're an atheist, where you believe that death is the end and you go out of existence. Transhumanism is basically the cure for death, in which they want to actually get to the point where they can create robotic bodies and transfer somebody's consciousness into that robotic body where they can continue to live indefinitely. And that's kind of the end goal of transhumanism. And so us as Christians, of course, we believe that, death is something that it's natural and it comes to all of us, and there's no escaping it. So whether or not we believe transhumanists will ever be successful in escaping death by their inventions where they can upload a consciousness into a computer or into a machine, Christians would say that that's not something that we should do, because death, we're not meant to live forever here in this world. We will eventually live forever, because there will be a final resurrection and a new heaven and a new earth. And that is the ultimate hope of the Christian, not living forever here on this earth in a robotic body or in a computer, because this world is fallen. All of creation is cursed. So if there's a better world waiting for us, then as Christians, we wouldn't want to stay here forever, because we do believe that there's a better world waiting for us. So from a religious standpoint, Christians have the hope of a life after death and an eternity after death. So we don't need to pursue transhumanism, because we have that hope. So transhumanism is really more for the atheists who believe that once you die, you're gone. No more consciousness, just an eternity of nothingness where you no longer exist. And so that's really the main goal is to basically have a cure for death. There are certain things which Christians can get behind. Obviously we can get behind bionic replacement of lost or damaged limbs. Like you just mentioned, Joel could get a robotic eye. Well, considering that he's blind in one eye, it would be permissible for Joel to get an eye that can help restore the sight that he's missing. Now, would it be permissible for Joel to have his other eye removed and then get 2 robotic implants? Christians would say, no, that's not permissible, because it's impermissible to remove a perfectly healthy organ and replace it, even if you're replacing it with something better. Because number one, humans were never meant to have, such improved eyesight in the first place. So, so there's no real obligation or anything like that to improve the human, the human ability in that sense. But also, if you have a perfectly healthy organ, then you are essentially frustrating the natural end of your organs. And since we're human beings, since we're rational beings, we have an obligation not to harm ourselves. And even if you remove a body part, like an arm or something, you get a bionic one, which can have certain improvements in certain cases. It would still be impermissible, because you're still harming yourself by removing a perfectly healthy limb and getting another one implanted, even if that limb has certain advantages over your natural limb. So there's still some ethical ramifications, even if we're not talking about the transhumanism where you upload someone's consciousness into a machine to live forever. There are certain ethical ramifications regarding replacing damaged or missing limbs, or replacing perfectly healthy limbs. And then apart from the ethical implications, there's also the metaphysical implication about whether or not it's even possible to upload someone's consciousness into a machine. So the atheist assumes that since he is just a collection of all of his memories and thoughts and emotions and everything, that if you upload his consciousness into a machine, the person who used to inhabit the human his identity will persist past that transposition of the consciousness into the new machine. But the problem is that especially if you take a more like Aristotelian approach to the human person, there's really no reason to assume that if you upload someone's consciousness into a machine, that person will persist. What's most likely going to happen is that you're going to kill the person, and then when that person's thoughts and emotions and memories are uploaded into the machine will believe himself to be the original, but he won't. You're actually going to kill the original and basically make the machine someone who believes himself to be the person whose consciousness was just uploaded. So there's also that dilemma as well. Whereas,
isn't that what happens every time they transport in Star Trek?
Yes, and so that's actually the problem with the Star Trek transporter too, because they disassemble you at the molecular level and then reassemble you somewhere else. And incidentally, Derek Parfit, who's an atheist philosopher, wrote a book. I have it on my shelf. I can go grab it if someone wants to see it. But he wrote a book called Reasons and Persons, in which he actually conceives of a teleportation machine like the transporter. And he constructs various thought experiments with it. For example, if you step into that transporter and it disassembles you, and then it sends your pattern to another transporter and reforms you there, is the being that reforms at a different location, is that you, or is that a different person, whereas you were killed in the original dissembling, and now you've been replaced by a double who believes himself to be an original? Or suppose that there is some kind of malfunction with the transporter, and so you get dissembled, and you're reassembled in the other at the other transporter, but your pattern also comes back to the original transporter and reassembles you on the original transporter. So now, which one is the original? Is it the one at the new transporter, or is it the one that was reassembled? So there's all kinds of thought experiments you can come up with the transporter as well. And Derek Parfit is a philosopher who actually did.
And they did a sort of getting down to the bones of it version of that thought experiment in the movie The Prestige.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what I was thinking about.
I don't think I've seen The Prestige, but they've actually done a couple of episodes like that on Star Trek.
So in The Prestige, spoiler alert, it's a
hold
movie
on. This
old.
Yeah, but I need to put up the spoiler banner for this one, because if you haven't seen it, you need to. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. We're good now.
Probably closer to 15 years. I don't know. Anyway, it's an older movie at this point. The general idea behind it is that there were two magicians, stage magicians, illusionists, who were in competition with each other after kind of a falling out between the two of them. And one of them came up with this sort of transportation trick where he would walk into a doorway on one side of the stage and then immediately walk out of the doorway on a totally other side of the stage. And, ordinarily magicians can kind of figure out how they do each other's tricks, but the one who was the rival couldn't quite figure it out. And so he approached, this was taking place in like the 1920s or something like that. He approaches Nikola Tesla and says, would it be possible to construct some kind of mechanism that would allow you to move from place to place instantaneously? And Tesla's like, that's a pretty good idea. Let me play around with that. So he did. And he essentially developed a machine that did not transport you from place to place, but did create a duplicate of you in another place. And so now this magician had that. He had this problem of, if he's putting on, 3 of these stage shows a week, and he's creating a duplicate of himself every single time in order to complete this particular trick, what's he going to do with all these duplicates? So he decides the solution to that is to have a trapdoor on the stage, and the trapdoor drops him into a tank of water, which immediately locks, and then the duplicate of him is transported to another place, and so he essentially kills himself in order to duplicate himself.
I have seen that film. That was with Hugh Jackman, right?
Yep.
Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale.
Christian Bale. Yeah. Okay, I have seen that one actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, he ends up killing himself every show.
Did the original kill himself, or did the duplicate get killed?
The original guy had an identical twin. That was how he performed it.
Oh no! No, I meant the guy who duplicates himself. Was it that the original kept killing himself, or did the duplicate was the duplicate the one that got killed?
It was the original that killed himself, and then the duplicate took his place. And then the next show, that duplicate would kill himself, and the duplicate would take his place.
Okay.
So
yeah. Right. Yeah, and so the way that I would kind of take that is that none of the duplicates were obviously original to or identical to the original. Because obviously two things can't be identical to one, so they can't be identical to each other.
Well, of course, this is a piece of fiction, but yeah, I mean,
right.
In terms of a thought experiment, you're talking about.
Yeah, and I actually I watch a lot of videos by Penn Jillette, half of Penn and Teller, and he actually did a reaction to certain magician scenes in movies, and one of the ones he did was The Prestige, where Hugh Jackman walks into like a door and appears in the other one, and Penn Jillette just said, he's got a double, because basically if there's only one way to do a trick, that's the way he did it. So. Right. Yeah, so I don't know why the other magician wouldn't have figured that he just had a double.
I'm sure that the movie kind of dug into that a little bit, but I don't remember clearly.
Yeah, it could be. I remember that, if I remember correctly, the movie was kind of told out of sequence a bit.
It was.
Yeah, so because that was actually, I do remember that it was a little bit hard for me to follow because it was told out of sequence. I actually went to Wikipedia to read the synopsis after I saw the movie to make sure I understood everything correctly. So yeah,
this almost gets into the sort of ship of Theseus dilemma.
Well, that's part of the dilemma, yeah. But that's part of the philosophy of the mind thought experiment about duplication and what's identical to
we're
something
being
else.
a nerdy episode. They made a direct reference to this in the WandaVision series.
Yeah, they did.
So,
it's becoming a very popular thing to bring up because you've also got, in addition, I was going to mention the WandaVision episode, but in addition, you've got the series Altered Carbon, which is essentially the same premise, but instead of being able to create a duplicate, people are kind of like sleeves, so their consciousness can be transferred from one to another. And they deal some with the ethical concerns of that. And then also on Black Mirror, they had an award-winning episode. I think it was called San Junipero. And it was about consciousness being uploaded to a simulation.
The first time that I really encountered the ship of Theseus dilemma was when I watched the stage production of Wizard of Oz, at which point it was clear, from Frank Baum, I think is the name of the original author, his original story, that the Tin Man was a real man. And the witch had cursed his axe or something like that. And so every time he swung the axe, it would swing back on him and cut a part of his body. And so he would go to a tinsmith, and the tinsmith would replace that part of his body with a tin version of it. So tin arm, tin leg, etc. And he would go right back to, chopping wood for some odd reason.
Yeah, that's interesting.
A different axe. And so that basically he became a tin man, a total tin man, because he continued to sever parts of his body and have them replaced. And then, of course, in the dilemma in the story was he didn't have a heart. So the tinsmith never replaced his heart, and therefore he didn't have the,
that's interesting. I've never read the original book, but I've seen the film, and they never did anything with that. I just assumed, that he was just always a tin man.
I had assumed he was sort of a mechanism, a robot. And it turns out that no, he was a cyborg at best.
It makes the story much more disturbing. I love it.
Yeah, but it was a ship of Theseus dilemma, which, for those of you who aren't aware, basically it's this idea of if a person owns a boat and the mast of the boat starts wearing out, so he gets the mast replaced. And then the floorboards of the boat start kind of getting rotten, so he gets them replaced. And he keeps replacing parts of the ship until the entire ship is replaced. At what point is it no longer the same ship? And so that's kind of the same thing. The Tin Man's a good example because after a point of replacing body parts with tin versions of them, is he no longer the same individual?
Yeah, and in fact, you can actually push the thought experiment further and say, suppose you replaced all of the boards and nails and everything on the ship, and then you constructed another ship with all of the original parts. Is the new ship with all of the original parts identical to the original, or is the new ship with all of the parts replaced identical to the original?
Yeah, which one is the original?
Yeah, but now here's the thing, because Doctor Who did a similar thing on I think it was the second Frank Capaldi season. But here's the thing, is that human beings are living things. They're not artifacts. And so human beings, all living things, basically maintain their identities through change. So the ship of Theseus doesn't really apply to a human being, because a human being can lose like I can lose an arm. And then if I get an arm replaced with a prosthetic arm, I still remain the same individual, because a human being, any change that doesn't kill the human being, the human being's identity is retained. But an artifact is different, because an artifact finds its identity in its parts. A car is not a car unless it's able to transport people or things from one point to another. So if a car ceases to be able to function as a car, is it still a car? If you hold to an Aristotelian view, then you would say no, it's a car in name only. It has the appearance of a car, but it can't function as a car because one of its parts isn't working. So the ship of Theseus can work with artifacts because an artifact finds its identity in its parts. So if you change out too many of an artifact's parts, it's no longer the same artifact because it doesn't have an underlying locus of identity to ground its identity as its parts are changing, whereas a human being does. Of course, with living things, as Christians, we would say the soul is what's the underlying thing that maintains an entity's identity through its changes. But artifacts don't have such a thing. So the ship of Theseus idea is a thought experiment relating to artifacts. If you try to relate it to living things, then it's kind of you're not really using the ship of Theseus properly in that case.
Well, and that's kind of the question that arises, of course, because there's not one view of this in terms of the human body. Am I the sum of my parts, or are there parts of me that, if removed, don't change my identity? I would say that from a naturalist perspective, you would say that your brain is probably the essential part of your nature. That, we often talk about the brain in the vat thought experiment is often talked about. And the reason that it's selected to be the brain in the vat is that one assumes the brain is the locus of consciousness in terms of all the neurons are firing and it's producing the kinds of behaviors and memories and so forth that make us who we are. And so the only essential part of us is our brain, such that if I had my brain replaced with a different brain, that would make me no longer the same person. But if I had practically all of my bodily parts replaced by prosthetics, I'd still be the same identical person. So that would be sort of a natural perspective.
Yeah, if you're a naturalist, but there's another idea in the philosophy of mind called animalism, which actually pushes back on the perspective that I am my brain, essentially, and it's that I'm not my brain, but that essentially I am an animal, because I come into existence as an animal. I have all these changes that I undergo. That basically the animal that I am now is identical to the animal that was in my mother's womb, because it's the same individual. That individual in the womb, all of its parts grew up into the being that I am now. So there's really no reason to assume that if, for example, if you have your brain removed, that wherever your brain goes, you would go also. If it would be possible to replace a person's brain. Well, some materialist or a property dualist might assume that if your brain gets removed and put in another body, then your consciousness would go with the brain. Or if you become brain dead and someone transplants a brain into your body, you are no longer the person that died, but it's a new person inhabiting your old body. There's really no reason to assume that's the case, because the brain is an organ just like everything else. If you have a heart replaced, you're the same individual after the heart replacement. If you have an arm replaced with a prosthetic, you're the same individual after that. So if it would be possible to replace a person's brain with another person's brain, say someone who became someone who died, but the brain was able to be preserved. If you could, and if you were to become brain dead, if they could keep you alive long enough to transplant someone else's brain into your body, theoretically, they could actually save you, and then you would just kind of wake up, and whatever came along with the brain, that you would have whatever came along with that brain, essentially, personality and memories, if memories are stored in the brain, and that kind of thing. And we can also think of other reasons to say that this is the case, because, for example, if you were to sustain a heavy brain injury and everything that you were, all your memories were lost, your personality changes after you come out of the coma, things like that. If you're a strict materialist who believes that you are your brain, well, if you suffer such an extraordinary brain accident that all of your memories are lost, all of your personality traits are gone, and you basically have to relearn everything, the strict materialist would have to say that you actually died in that accident, and the person that comes to in your body is a brand new person. But that seems to be that seems to be an absurd way to think about it, because you're still the person that wakes up, even though has forgotten everything and has to relearn everything, is the same biological individual who was present before the brain accident. And you can also think, well, if something like that happens to me, I have a vested interest in what the new relearned individual does. So if you have a vested interest in what that new individual does, you don't want anyone to kill that individual or to rape that individual or steal from that individual, even though that individual will have a completely different personality from you. Well, that seems to imply that you do have that since you do have a vested interest in what happens to that individual will still be you. It won't be a brand new person who wakes up. So it's just, I don't see that there's any reason to assume that I am identical to my brain or my brain states or anything like that. And there are some like Eric Olson has written a very convincing argument for animalism in one of his books. The Human Animal, I think, is what it's called. So I would really push back on someone who thinks that he is identical to his brain or his brain states.
Now, see, my training and my field is in sort of a Skinnerian behaviorism, and B.F. Skinner, who more or less created the field of behaviorism, had a very interesting perspective on this, an interesting idea of what makes you who you are, and the nature of any given human being or animal, and that is a field of behavior, meaning field of behaviors, meaning that he didn't associate a person with their brain or with their body or anything else. He associated them with their behaviors. So every behavior that I have is sort of a product of my experiences over time. And so I behave towards, say, my mother in a way which neither of you would because of my learning experience with my mother. And, I would behave towards technology in a way that resembles the learning experience that I have. And so these are all fields of behaviors that I have developed over time through experience that interact with each other and determine how I would behave in any given situation based on my past. Now, obviously, behaviors change over time as one continues to learn and go through experiences. But he also associated things like language as behaviors. So every word that I'm using right now, I'm using because of a past history of learning and behaviors such that my act of speaking and selecting words are behaviors, and their reactions to particular reinforcers. In this case, perhaps the reinforcement I'm getting from attention. I'm behaving in such a way to get attention, something like that. And so,
you mean like Roxy here?
Yeah. So based on his perspective, if you could create some sort of biological organism which had the exact same fields of behavior interacting as I do, it would be the same person, because we are not our minds or our bodies, we are our behaviors.
Does he think it'd be numerically the same person?
When you say numerically, I'm not sure I understand.
Does he mean like you'd be the same person in the sense that you are identical to each other?
To basically, under Skinner's philosophy, he does not. He takes organisms. The difference between a machine and an organism is that organisms are behaving things. They have reactions, and they have the capacity to learn and develop over time. With Skinner, you have what they call the dead man test. And the dead man is that a behavior is anything that a dead man would not do. So if I were to lie down lying there would not be a behavior because a dead man could do that. But standing up would be a behavior because a dead man couldn't do that. And so any sort of behaving organism that is something that interacts with its environment is an organism. It is living. So to live is to behave, according to Skinner. And he said that, there's really no way in which we can prove that mental states exist. And mental states are always inferred from behavior. So, for instance, if Roxy there hears a noise outside and gets all excited and starts jumping around and running around the house, you could say that she was scared or she was excited or something like that. But Skinner would come back by saying, okay, so you're saying that she's running around because she's excited, but the way in which you know she's excited is because she's running around. It's circular reasoning. Basically, you've got noise, event within head, behavior. He says, why do we have to postulate an event within the head when the behavior is caused by the noise? It's under the control of the environment around it. We postulate a sort of mental state from the behavior, but why do we need that third step, which is unnecessary to explain the behavior when it's under control of the environment? And so that's his perspective on things. He doesn't take into account mental states or neurology or anything like that. I think that he would say, since we can observe neurological responses and things like that, that those don't, it's not that those don't exist, but he would categorize those as behaviors because they're responding to the environment.
Yeah, I'm not sure how popular the view is that there are no such things as mental states. I mean, mental states seem to be pretty much a given in philosophy of mind. Now, obviously, he's a psychologist, not a philosopher per se. But yeah, I don't know if any philosophers have really interacted with B.F. Skinner's work. I know I've seen him quoted, but
I would recommend that you actually read his book, Science and Human Behavior, because he is oddly very philosophical, which I didn't expect him to be, considering that his is a very empirical approach to life, meaning that he only postulates those things which can be observed and cataloged. And for him, philosophy is just so much conjecture over things that are what he would call explanatory fictions. We create some fictional story to explain observable things. Why can't we just look at the cause and effect to explain the observable things?
Yeah.
So in that view, if it's the case that behaviors were to make up a person, in that sense, then that would play into the theory that transhumanism is something that's possible, especially the end goal of eventually uploading ourselves into some kind of virtual world, right?
Only if the individual that comes out the other end has the exact same behaviors that I do. Now, Skinner would say that my behaviors are a product of my history. I behave the way that I do because of the history that I've experienced, and because I respond to my environment. The environments that I've transitioned through over time have created learning, and learning has resulted in behaviors, such that if there was something that didn't share that history, then its behaviors would be explained through some other means. But yeah, Skinner, if he was faced with the idea of uploading my consciousness to a computer and then sticking it in another body or something, and then that individual were to behave exactly as I do, there is some kind of implied history there. For Skinner, there were three kinds of histories that one had to take into account. One was biological history, meaning the history of evolution of the organism. That organism comes out generates as an original life form as a result of a history of the species that preceded it. The second, he would say, would be the individual's history. You know, that life form transitions through environments and experiences which result in behaviors. So that's another form of history. And the third he had was cultural history. You know, there are certain behaviors that are ingrained into a human being because of the history of that human being's culture. And they're kind of imbued into that human being from the surrounding cultural environment, and more or less kind of the approval and disapproval of those individuals which surround the person. So they're transferred through the history of that culture into the individual's behavior. And so those three histories would need to be necessary in order to make that individual who that individual was.
Yeah, and so when I think of a strict materialist, I don't think it's plausible at all that you can upload someone's consciousness into a machine and have that person's identity persist with that machine, whether it's, you know, someone like B.F. Skinner in his view, or someone who thinks that, you know, I'm identical to my brain and my memories and all that kind of thing are what make me who I am. Because if you upload all of that into a machine, well, you know, it's like essentially you know, putting a bag of marbles into a box. You know, a bag of marbles, you know, it's just a heap of marbles. There's no real internal consistency to the collection of marbles that makes the collection of marbles what they are. They're just marbles that happen to be spatially located near each other. So, you know, if you just put that collection of marbles in a box, well, you still have just like a loose collection of marbles. They don't really make anything together. You know, you have to like glue them together or make something with them before they become anything. So if you're just going to upload someone's thoughts, emotions, etc., into a machine, there's nothing underlying that to make it a person, to guarantee that, that the person whose consciousness you're uploading will go along with all of those thoughts and memories and emotions that you send to the new machine.
So this sort of, you know, brushes up against things like the mind-body interaction and the origin of consciousness. So, you know, something we might need to look at in the near future would be pan-psychism as an explanation for consciousness. But before we think about that, what are your thoughts on mind-body dualism?
Well, you know, unfortunately, I didn't have much of a chance to really prepare for the for the program tonight. So you know, I could come back later and talk more about it. But yeah, mind-body dualism. You know, I think dualists are closer to the truth than a strict monist would be. Someone who thinks that we're just identical to our body, and that there's only one substance, the physical substance. And so, yeah, if you're talking about something like a property dualist, who again thinks that you know, there's two substances, the physical substance and then the mental substance. Well, I think that's closer to the truth, but I don't quite think that's it. But you know, if there's no immaterial thing that grounds somebody's identity, then again, if you're just going to upload all of the individual thoughts and memories and things into a consciousness, I'm not sure how, you know, like just a mind-body dualism gets around that, because there's nothing really underlying that grounds the person's identity to guarantee that it persists from one moment to the next. So yeah, I just don't see how it would be possible. Like even on my view, you know, it's theoretically possible that, you know, for example, we see in films and books that, you know, like two people's souls like switch bodies and each one becomes the other person. That's theoretically possible, even if not very plausible on a view, if the soul exists. But I don't see how that would be at all plausible if just mind-body dualism were the case.
Now, one could make the argument from a purely biblical perspective that if you allow for things like demonic possession, then you've sort of allowed this idea that there could be consciousness that belongs to some entity that can be transferred into the body of another entity and result in particular behaviors that are not that are novel to that particular entity. So if a demon were to take over my body right now, there would be novel behaviors that would be displayed through myself that belong not to my particular consciousness, but to the consciousness of another.
Yeah, with demon possession, that's another another bag entirely. That
Well, demon possession doesn't have to be touched on, but if you allow for the possibility of demon possession, you allow for the possibility that there are non-material consciousness that do have some kind of interaction with the body. There's an argument that could be made if you allow for demonic possession, you allow for a mind-body dualism.
That would put a bit of a kink in Skinner's work, right?
Skinner, I don't think that he ruled out the possibility of minds or mental states. He just thought that they were unnecessary to explain human behavior or organism behavior when you could easily explain that behavior from observable data. And so, if a demon possession were to be somehow forced into his perspective, he could easily say that what you're talking about is another behaving creature. We can't say organism because, this is a spiritual entity. But the spiritual entity is also a product of its history, and the behaviors that it displays are a result of the things that it finds motivating and reinforcing.
Because I know there are such things as Christian physicalists who don't believe in the soul, and I'm not sure how they would handle the accounts of demon possession that we see in Scripture. But
I would love to actually ask one of them about that because, I've seen that, and they get around the whole mind-body thing by saying that in the resurrection, the thing that's resurrected is your body. Mm-hmm. We don't need to postulate, say, a sort of spiritual heavenly state. That's kind of unnecessary, and the Bible, would allow us to get around that if you consider sort of this new heaven, new earth state of being the kingdom of God, not sort of an airy spiritual existence out there somewhere. I can see that perspective. I am sympathetic myself to dualism, but I don't have enough background in it to make a defense of it.
Yeah, I don't think Christian physicalism is plausible. I just think it's just obvious from Scripture that there's a spiritual component to human beings, and as a hylomorphist myself, I believe that there's a spiritual component, what you might call the form of humanity, which in the case of humans is the soul, because that's your rational. That's the thing that grounds your rational capacities. So I think. I personally think it's just obvious that there's a spiritual component. The people I know of who are Christian physicalists are not dumb people. I'm not sure why they've hung their hat on Christian physicalism, because I just think from Scripture it's obvious that there's a spiritual component. If you leave Scripture aside and just argue philosophically, well then there is a stronger case to be made, because obviously all atheists or at least most atheists are going to be physicalists in some respect, and not all, because there are some that are dualists, like mind body dualists or property dualists, like Michael Tooley. But I think Christian physicalism is just implausible.
So the atheists and naturalists have to struggle with the idea of consciousness and how does consciousness arise. And ordinarily, you'd see sort of a naturalist approach to that say that consciousness is sort of an illusion created by neural activity in the brain, or at the very best is a product of the brain. So it's produced by the brain. Although your friend and mine, and I say that sort of ironically,
Are you talking about
Benjamin
Tony Jump?
Watkins.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he subscribes to panpsychism, and panpsychism is the idea that the brain doesn't produce consciousness; it receives consciousness, and that consciousness is a product of the universe, more or less. That certain organisms have evolved to the point where they can receive consciousness and therefore display elements that are unique to conscious organisms.
Yeah. Now, does Benjamin Watkins actually have a philosophy degree?
I know he does a lot of reading in philosophy. I don't know what his academic background is.
Okay, because he calls himself a philosopher, and from what I've seen, he's not a very good one. He's really bad at, and I don't, I'm not saying that you can't be a good philosopher without credentials. Obviously, I do philosophy without credentials, and I don't want people to discount my work just because I don't have credentials. But so I don't really say that lightly. It's just Benjamin Watkins is really terrible at understanding the views of people who disagree with him. And if you're his friend on Facebook, then he's constantly posting memes, which shows that he just does not understand the views of the people who disagree with them. And it's gotten to the point where I just don't interact with him anymore because, number one, he doesn't listen, and number two, he cares more about caricaturing your point of view rather than getting to know what you believe and trying to convince you through reason. He really, really got that Trump derangement syndrome bad. That really sent him kind of over the deep end of just not wanting to get to know why people would vote for Trump. He just thinks they're all evil idiots, essentially. So.
Yeah, and I think that's the genesis of that is, I've known him long enough to know that he has been generous in the past about people's viewpoints and so forth.
He used to be.
The origin of his particular behavior at this point was political, not philosophical.
Right.
And that's the downfall of a lot of the Christian non-Christian interaction is that it's so heavily attached to political histories and political ideology that it's difficult to get around that barrier to have any kind of discussion that exists outside of political. And I think that to a degree, it's because certain individuals are political individuals. This is the sort of locus of their identity is around their politics to the degree that it's difficult to extract the individual from the politics.
Yeah, I think that's
highly unfortunate.
Right. And I think, that's just kind of how things have gotten, because it's not just with someone like Benjamin Watkins. Like I can't talk to a lot of my Christian friends about the coronavirus, like wearing masks or things like that, because the discussions just get they get pretty nasty, no matter what side of the issue. Pro-mask, anti-mask, pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine. The conversations get pretty nasty now, to the point where I've just stopped having these discussions altogether. Like people who are pretty good friends have started to get nasty toward me just because I disagree with them on certain elements of the masking and vaccine usage. So what are you going to do?
Not to mention you have those claims that vaccine serves as the mark of the beast, and I'm sure that's not helped by people politically calling for vaccine cards being necessary to travel and do X, Y, Z.
And here's the thing: I'm a partial preterist, so I'm not looking for a rapture. And this is like old hat, because there have been other situations in which someone had to abide by certain rules in order to be able to buy and share in the public sphere and things like that. So I don't see this as the mark of the beast, but there are similarities to it, and that you're not going to be able to travel. If this thing passes, you won't be able to travel without having this vaccine card. You won't be able to buy from the grocery store. In fact, it turns out that you might not even be able to get rescued if you're in danger. I saw going around Facebook that there was a fire or an earthquake that happened somewhere in the United States, and like the rescue operation was going on, but they wouldn't let anyone on the boat who hadn't gotten the coronavirus vaccine. I I don't remember what it was, but I saw it going around Facebook. I'd have to go back and look it up to see what it is. But if that's the case, then that's pretty unfortunate, especially since some people just aren't allowed to get the vaccine right now. So.
Yeah, that's I hadn't heard that. That's a whole nother level.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find it real quick. See what that was.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of this is overreactionism to the point that a person's perspective isn't grounded so much in their own ideology as it is a reaction to an ideology to which they disagree or with which they disagree. So if the opponent over there says red, then you say blue, not because you originally thought it was blue, but because you're responding to their statement of red. There can be no agreeal. Everything they say, they are fundamentally wrong or liars about things, such that you set your standards based on opposing them, which is dangerous, I believe.
I would agree. Polarization gets to the point where it's extremely dangerous. It's certainly caused a number of issues, not just in this country, but I think we could relate a lot of problems back to the political polarization of things. Not to mention, just on the whole vaccine note, it seems like poor theological reasoning, regardless of your eschatology. Mark of the Beast seems to be very clearly a giving of allegiance. Yes, it has consequences with it, but it seems to be very clearly an allegiance that's being given versus just a tattoo or whatever physical attribute you want to give it.
So, since the topic has been broached and some listeners may not be familiar with what it means, preterism is the concept that a lot of the end times types prophecies that one takes from specifically the New Testament, statements made by Jesus and by in the book of Revelation, referred to events that were occurring contemporaneously with the writing of those passages, rather than some point in the eventual or future of the human race. And so the Mark of the Beast, a preterist would more ordinarily say that was referring to some kind of allegiance to Nero at the time, which, permitted or not the individual from being able to make trade within public society at the time, because one had to do so in the name of the emperor. If I've got that wrong, you may correct me.
Clinton?
I mean, yeah, I didn't really hear anything there that sounded egregiously wrong.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to stop with I didn't hear anything there.
Oh, no. I was trying to listen, but I'm also trying to find that thing I found, because now I'm really curious. I'm not 100% sure if it's true, because I didn't vet it. And I usually vet things before sharing, but if it is true, it's pretty alarming. So
Right. Yeah, I can certainly see why that would raise even additional concerns for people, because there are certainly valid reasons for waiting for a vaccination. I wouldn't say there are many valid reasons for not getting one per se, but there's definitely good reasons to wait.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that there are a couple of different schools of preterism too. There's full preterism, which would say that everything in the book of Revelation has happened already. And then there's partial preterism, which is the position I hold to, which is that much of what we see in Revelation has happened, but there are still parts that are yet to come. Like Christ's 2,000-year reign is still to come. The creation of the new heaven and the new earth is still to come, and things like that. So I'm a partial preterist in that, I think that, certain things like, like if you where Revelation talks about like the mark of the beast and it's the number of a man, 666. Well, for example, many partial preterists believe that was actually a reference, a future prophecy to Nero, because if you look at Nero's name in Greek, I think it was, then the letters in his name correspond to 666, and so things like that. So yeah. That's just pretty much a clarification there. I still believe certain things like Christ's 2,000-year reign and the like his second coming and things like that are still in the future.
So you had mentioned the mark was clearly allegiance. I wanted to read the passage in context because I did seem to remember it being like specifically located on body parts, and I'm reading it now. This is from Revelation 13:16. It said, "It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on the right hand or on their forehead, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name." So,
yeah, I mean, the important thing to remember though is that Revelation is all about imagery. So, it didn't have to be like a literal tattoo someone would get on their forehead or on their wrist.
And I hear that. The reason that I brought it up at all is because I wouldn't want to misrepresent the other position, and the other position isn't responding to some sort of general claim. There is the specific, detail about it being placed on a body part, which is why they come to the conclusion that this is some sort of either mark or injection or some kind of physical thing, which relates to the physical body.
Absolutely, right. That's fair to bring up.
Yeah, I don't believe I said it was clearly disobedience. If I did, then I probably misspoke.
That was me. I think from the greater context of Revelation as well as what we're seeing here. I think, for me at least, it seems to indicate a clear giving of allegiance, even if there is a physical mark associated with that. The greater issue here, and where we'd have to deal with the sin, I think, is in the actual giving of the allegiance here.
Yeah. So I think that you could, whatever the case, preterist or hold on, I know the other term. Dispensationalist. There we go. A preterist or dispensationalist, you would have to, hail back to the fact that if you are forced, which is what the passage seems to indicate, to do a thing rather than doing it on your own volition, then one could not claim that Christ would not be forgiving towards that action that was not your action. There is an element of repentance and forgiveness inherent in the Christian ideology that seems to counter-indicate this idea that if somebody twists your arm, holds you down, and gives you a tattoo, that God would then not forgive you and of that particular crime.
Okay, I found what I was alluding to. So there's an article here. It's on Bloomberg.com, which I think may be a conservative site, but it's a legitimate news site from what I understand. And it says here that the headline is "COVID hampers St. Vincent evacuation amid volcanic eruption." So what happened is the Eastern Caribbean island of St. Vincent had a volcano that erupted, and so the pandemic then is causing delays. And then where was it? So the cruise ships were there to try and get people onto the ships, and then get those people to safety because of the lava coming down. And so there were some of the ships, I'm not sure how many, but at least some of them were refusing to allow people on who hadn't yet gotten a COVID vaccine. So essentially, on the Caribbean island of St. Vincent, when the volcano erupted, if you didn't have the COVID vaccine, you couldn't get rescued by at least some of the cruise ships that were there to rescue people and carry them to safety.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
So, yeah,
very. Do either of you have any lines of thought you want to continue with this? If not, I've got a question I want to go back to.
Well, I guess I could just kind of give a little plug here. I have a book here by Fazale Rana called Humans 2.0, which is about transhumanism. And on my pro-life thinking podcast, I actually interviewed Faz Rana about his book, and we talk about transhumanism. So if anyone here wants to get a little, dive a little deeper regarding the ethics of transhumanism and wants to get, Faz Rana's thoughts on that, they can go check that out as well. Or pick up his book too. And I know Douglas Groothuis has done a book on transhumanism. I haven't read Doug's book yet, but that's definitely on my radar, something I'd like to read. But for a little more info, maybe on stuff that we haven't touched on in this broadcast here, they can check that out if they want some more information.
In my head, I've always pronounced his name Groothuis.
Oh, no, it's Groothuis. And
I'm going to call him Groothuis anyway.
Okay, yeah, Groothuis. Yeah, no. In fact, when he talks live, I don't know if he does it at every talk, but he'll actually give the pronunciation while he's talking, because it is a difficult one to pronounce if you haven't actually heard him pronounce it.
Yeah, no, I recently listened through the audiobook of the new Evidence That Demands a Verdict, the one that was put out more recently.
It's like 45 hours long.
42, but yeah.
Oh, really?
And they make they cite Groothuis several times, and that's how I learned the actual pronunciation of his name.
All right, yeah.
One of the earliest apologetics books I was ever given was his apologetic book.
Oh, he's coming out with the second edition of that one.
I haven't read the first edition. I'm trying to see if I can see it on my shelf back here, but
yeah, I actually met him.
Evidence That Demands a Verdict, but it's doggone thick.
Yeah, Christian Apologetics. He's doing a second edition of it. He's working on it right now. I got to meet him. Yeah, I got to meet him last January, back in the year 2000, before COVID hit. Because I did a that's a pretty thick book. Because I did a breakout session at a conference he was speaking at, and so I got to meet him between speaking sessions, and I got to listen to him talk too. And so yeah, he's a really nice guy, and I got to buy a couple books and get him signed, and so I would like to get his Christian Apologetics book, but I'm really waiting until he finishes his second edition and publishes it. So
yeah, that's one of the things I miss about being a Christian journalist, is being able to meet these guys and also interview them, because otherwise you walk up to them and say, "Hey, I'm just a guy," and
right.
A little more awkward.
Wanted to say hi to you.
Right. Yeah. And actually, at that conference, Doug did say that he thinks that transhumanism is an issue that Christians need to hit up more often, because that's kind of the big issue, one of the bigger issues of today. So, it's good and timely that we're doing one on transhumanism.
It seems like a lot of transhumanism currently is more theoretical than actual, because there might be some small degree in which certain things about you can be uploaded to a machine, but I really don't think they've yet got the technology to put all of your memories and brain patterns in a machine just yet.
Yeah, that's still quite a ways off.
Let's take a slightly different scenario then. And this is one that came up due to a recent podcast that was released that's actually really good in terms of podcasting and storytelling, called The Oyster. The premises of The Oyster.
That's the name of the podcast, or the name of the episode?
It's the name of the podcast, The Oyster.
Oh, okay.
I'll throw the spoiler warning up, because I'm going to give very, very brief, probably introductory episode spoilers. Of course, this is a fiction story, but it's set in a world where, due to, I think, an asteroid impact or some other catastrophe, humanity above the surface has become unsustainable. So people move into the Oyster, which is essentially like a Noah's Ark for humanity. First ethical dilemma they have is who gets to come on board, because they can only fit like 1/3 of the population on it. The second...
This is subterranean dwelling on the Earth?
Yes. The second major issue is they don't have enough resources to take care of everybody. So they have a solution, and the solution involves virtual reality and drugs. So they essentially have a certain amount of people volunteer to be given, I think it was DMT, and be plugged into VR. So they live a life of almost constant kind of pleasure and excitement within a VR unit. And because of this, they use up less resources. They don't require as many calories as they would otherwise. They just pump in whatever calories they need to survive.
So it's basically Wall-E.
Yeah, kind of, except, the people are permanently plugged in. They don't even get the freedom to kind of move around and interact on the ship. If you just had a room hidden away in Wall-E where all these people are hooked into VR in a borderline vegetative state, then yeah, it would be Wall-E.
So it's like Wall-E and Matrix fusion.
Right. So, it raises the issue about this. I would consider it kind of in the realm of transhumanism. If we were in a situation that required limited resources, what kind of ethical issues are we dealing with in that kind of scenario of people being permanently plugged into something? And I think it's something that's probably an issue that's coming up way sooner than looking at, consciousness being uploaded, but looking at people who are permanently plugged in for a better life. They can have a better life in VR than they could in reality.
That depends on your definition of better life.
Right.
Because everything, and that's actually a common thread in science fiction too, is, is it a better life for you to live inside of a virtual environment rather than living out in the real world? And usually shows like Star Trek or other science fiction shows and movies that investigate this kind of thing tend to come down on the side of it's always better to live in reality than in a virtual reality, despite all of the flaws and bad things of reality. Living in a fake environment, even though all of your needs are met, would be worse than living in reality. That's usually where a show or a movie like this comes down on when they investigate these kinds of things.
Well, let me expand on that a little bit for you, because this is an area in which I put a lot of thought and done a lot of writing. So I believe it was Bertrand Russell, although it might have been some other famous atheist. Who was that playwright? I don't know. Bernard Shaw? Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, basically the person sort of demeaned religion in general, because this person was saying that, religion sort of gives you this false sense of purpose or joy or happiness, and it would be better to be a realist and miserable than to be living in sort of a delusional fantasy and happy. And this is something that I confront atheists with on occasionally. Is okay. Let's say that the individual that you're talking to is religious, and because they're religious, they're feeling happy and fulfilled. Remove that religion from them, and they're not. So the question here is, which is better, to pursue truth and to, is it better to pursue truth or to be happy? Which would you put as the higher standard, truth or happiness? And so you could expand this to something like, what you're talking about, being in sort of a drugged state. You're drugged at all times. The drugs are giving you a feeling of happiness, euphoria, just generally good feelings. But you, in a sense, aren't really interacting with the real world. Your feelings of euphoria and happiness are manufactured. They're chemical, they're artificial, versus some actual experience. And I expand this to a thought experiment. I call it the genie in the bottle experiment. So this is a thought experiment that every child and adult has ever been confronted with. Well, if you got 3 wishes from a genie, you're out of the beach, you stumble across a bottle, genie pops out and gives you 3 wishes. What would they be? Well, people are going to say things like money or eternal life or good looks or world peace or something like that. All right, they're always going to ask for some sort of physical item or situation, like life situation. At no point are you ever going to present a person with that scenario and for them to spontaneously say, happiness. I would wish for happiness. They always attach it to some kind of situation or item. Ultimately, yeah, that's the goal. They want to be fulfilled, but they want to do so through a vehicle rather than just jump straight to the fulfillment without a circumstance or item attached to that fulfillment. And so, the question is, why is it the human state to want to achieve fulfillment versus just have it? Now, I could tell you why I think that is a sort of a real thing, but from a purely philosophical perspective, it's a question worth pondering. I could give you my take on it, but feel free to give me yours.
Yeah, I have nothing really to add here.
I don't know that I've kind of worked that scenario over enough in my head yet to have a coherent response to it just yet.
Yeah, because the feed got a little choppy, so I think I may have actually missed something about the scenario.
Well, I ran through several scenarios very quickly. Did you get the genie in the bottle scenario?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Basically, it's this. You're given 3 wishes from a genie. What are your 3 wishes going to be? Any person that you ever present with that is going to give you some kind of situation or item that they want. They're going to ask for, a new car or good looks or eternal life or world peace or something like that. At no point are you going to present somebody with that scenario and for them to spontaneously say, well, I would want happiness. I would want fulfillment. I would want this sort of end. No, they want the means to get to the end because, you get a new car because you want to be fulfilled. There's a sense of fulfillment that comes with the obtaining of that new car, but you don't ask for the fulfillment without the vehicle attached to it. Another way to think of it is, which is better, to be Batman or the Joker? The Joker is perpetually happy. He's a happy guy. And that happiness is inherent to his nature and not attached to a circumstance. He's as happy locked up in an insane asylum as he is out in a chemical factory or, anywhere. Being happy is just part of his nature. And wouldn't that be better than being Batman, who's down brooding in your cave all the time and just kind of eternally miserable, and always sort of pursuing a vengeance or a justice that you'll never achieve? But no single individual out there is going to want to be Joker over being Batman. Everybody would want to be Batman, who is pursuing a goal, even if he can never obtain it, than Joker, who is just inherently happy.
Yeah, and it'd probably be what makes the difference is what each character stands for. That Batman stands for justice, and the Joker stands for anarchy.
Right. So these are Jungian archetypes. So in that sense, yeah, they're modes of a story that represent something is essential to human experience, that is the pursuit of one ideology over the other, or just sort of an archetype or avatar for justice or insanity or what have you. But yeah, I mean, the idea is, why do we inherently elevate sort of truth and pursuit over the ends to which those things are aimed?
For one, I think you could say that some of it, culturally looking at it, is probably very much a part of just the culture that's developed over time. And I think the influence of Judeo-Christian values is also probably a significant influence on why we've done that. Because I could give a theological answer as to why, I think the living life is better than just the attainment of instant happiness. And I think there's some value in a purely non-religious, non-theological answer, if you will. But I can't say I could put my finger on that in the same way that I can from a theological standpoint. I think it has a very clear answer from that standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, from a cultural perspective, you could, like, for instance, you've got sort of this Protestant work ethic, and that says that the ultimate end towards which humans exist is to work, and by working to achieve some sense of purpose, versus more of a Marxist concept, wherein, I don't know, maybe Marx was more of a achievement through working as well.
Right. Like, if you look at, go ahead.
Yeah, I sorry, the one that had crossed my head was Epicureanism or hedonism, which is this idea that the pursuit is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain or misery or what have you, such that any achievement of maximizing pleasure, whether that be done through hard work or drugs, would be to reach the ultimate end, which is essentially that. Your wish on the genie is happiness, to the ultimate end of pleasure, kind of thing. So it has existed in the past, you're right. And I think culturally we react against hedonism and Epicureanism, and more tend to drift in the direction of Stoicism, from sort of an ancient Greek philosophy perspective. So yeah, you're right. That kind of thing has been advocated for in the past under certain philosophical situations.
So are you going to give us your take on this?
So it is my take from a Christian perspective, this is theology, that the end of human beings is to actualize some factor of God's nature. And so you see this in sort of a Romans 6, sort of the Calvinistic perspective, where it says that, there were vessels created, some for wrath and some for deliverance, or whatever the passage says. But essentially what I'm saying here is that, you have in God a sort of a dichotomy. One is the sort of mercy, love, forgiveness side, and the other is the sort of justice, holiness, the sort of elimination of evil side. And so, there are, theologically, we could argue that there are human beings which are going to be on the receiving end of both of those things. You have those who are on the receiving ends of the punishment or elimination of evil, and those who are on the other side of forgiveness and love and mercy. And so what happens is that as a human being, regardless of which end you're on in that particular dichotomy, you are in fact actualizing some aspect of God's nature. You know, if there were no sinners, then God could not be merciful or judgmental, just, let's say. He could neither be merciful or just because there would be no circumstance under which those attributes would be exercised. And so just being a human being, your existence, your circumstances serve some kind of eternal purpose because they feed into God's nature. So regardless of what my particular end is, I have served an eternal purpose. I have become part of this eternal story because I have contributed to the actualization of some aspect of God's nature.
Okay, so that's put similarly, but I won't say exactly as kind of the Westminster Catechism puts it, because question 1 is what is the chief end of man? And the response given is man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. And of course, they back this with Scripture.
I never really liked that answer.
I always thought the chief end of man was his head.
Seems trite.
Yeah, actually, I have a copy of the Westminster Shorter Catechism on my bookshelf here.
Yeah, and the reason for that is that, to me, it seemed a little self-serving. That, my chief end is to sort of pursue my own enjoyment of God. My perspective is that the chief end of man is to actualize some aspect of God's nature. We exist.
Okay.
Well,
doesn't that raise a problem, though? Sorry to cut you off, Glenn.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, well, I mean, that we have to understand what it means by chief end. It doesn't mean like what is man's purpose in life. It's more like what was man created to do. And so we were created to enjoy God, to worship God and enjoy Him forever. So it's not necessarily a self-serving thing. It's more the question of what was man created for. We were created to worship God and enjoy Him forever.
And of course, the skeptical response to that is, isn't God sort of a narcissist if He has to create an audience to worship Him? He needs worshipers, so He manufactures them out of thin air because that's just something He needs, is for people to worship Him.
No, God didn't need anything. God is perfect, and so since He was perfect, He lacks nothing. That's why this.
The difference between saying that the purpose of man would be to worship God versus to actualize part of God's nature is that in actualizing God's nature, it's a direct feedback on part of who God is, versus having something external to Him to sort of fall down and worship Him. He has something external to Him which reveals or actualizes His full nature. God is not loving unless He loves. God is not just unless He exercises justice. And so a God without anything external to Himself to interact with is static, and there's very little difference between an invisible, intangible, static being and nothing at all.
Okay, well, Caleb had something to say, and then I'll
Yeah, I was just going to say, doesn't that, and maybe you can clarify this for me, but wouldn't that, in essence, put God's nature in such a way that it is requiring something? Maybe I'm missing how you're answering that aspect of this, but if God's nature is not actualized until He has humans to actualize some part of it, then is God not incomplete?
So I would say that it is a consequence of His nature, not a need that he has. You wake up in the morning and you yawn. That yawn was a thing that you did inherently, but there was an atmosphere around you that allowed you to yawn. Now, God, of course, was, you could argue that God began in solipsism, as a necessary self-existent being. But imagine, if you will, that as part of his nature, he stretches. The act of stretching is an act of creation, in a sense, because versus, being static is one thing, but to act at all is to create a space in which one acts. So I say my philosophy on that is that creation was an eternal act of God. There was never a point at which God did not create. It is being a creator is part of his nature. So simply by existing, he creates. It's a natural consequence of his nature. And once creation occurs, there are non-God objects that exist within the universe, and then God interacts with a universe external to himself.
Yeah, the problem I have with the response being the chief end of man is to actualize some part of God's nature is that's something that even atheists can accomplish. Atheists can actualize parts of God's nature because they were created in God's image. Even if they don't eventually come to Christ and repent of their sins, they're still created in God's image, and as such, they're able to do things like God. They're able to create themselves. They're able to engage in rational thought, etc., etc. And so it seems like if even atheists can actualize some part of God's nature, if that's really what we were created to do, then God would be happy with an atheist just fulfilling that part of his nature, because that's what he was created to do. So it seems like we're probably created to do more than simply actualizing God's nature, because if someone doesn't repent of their sins, if someone doesn't worship God, then it seems like they're not living in such a way as to contribute to what they were actually created to do.
So there's a verse in Deuteronomy, I believe. It might be in Exodus, because it's anyway, it's something wherein God kind of communicates to the people of Israel his nature. And it says that God is, I'm going to be paraphrasing pretty badly here, but it's, the Lord your God is loving and righteous and forgiving of sins, but he will by no means clear the wicked, bringing the wrath of judgment upon up to the third and fourth generation, something in that degree. But the verse itself appears to be a paradox. In the same breath, it says that God is loving and forgiving and merciful, but God will not clear the wicked. And so this is a sort of paradox which is presented very early on in Scripture and is then resolved through the work and person of Christ. Because Christ, on his first appearance on earth, came to forgive. He created a circumstance which allowed God to be forgiving, because it satisfied God's need to enact judgment, and also gave him a vehicle by which he could forgive. We could get into the theology behind that, but I'm not going to. But at that point, the verse in Deuteronomy suddenly makes sense, because both aspects of God's nature, the mercy and forgiveness versus the justice and righteousness, and when I say righteousness, I mean making all things right. His holy nature cannot abide things which are unholy, and therefore by his nature he eliminates those things. But both of those aspects of God's nature are only possible, they're only actualized, let's say, when there are people that exist that both of those aspects respond to. So yes, atheists actually do serve a purpose. They exist, and in the fact of existing and not asking for forgiveness or repentance, God enacts that aspect of his nature, that he will eliminate sin or unrighteousness or evil one way or the other, either by forgiveness or by justice. And so, yeah, there is not an individual that has existed in history who has been purposeless, who has been, extraneous, unnecessary. Every individual who's ever existed has allowed God to actualize himself in one way or another. And allowed is probably the wrong word, but you get the point.
I can see where you're coming from, at least. Clinton, any follow-up thoughts?
No, not really. I mean, it's not really. I mean, not really a point that that not really. I guess a hill that I'm really that interested in dying in. Right. We can disagree on this, and it's not going to. In
an earlier episode, it may have even just been last episode, I had talked about necessary world theology, which one aspect of that I said was that part of God's omnipresence was omnipresence across time as well as space. He exists categorically through all time and space simultaneously. And, that was as opposed to more of a Molinistic perspective where he enters time and proceeds to travel through time temporally the way that we do. And, I could allow for that as well. I'm not going to make the argument for that. But my point is that necessary world theology also ties into what I just said about the reason that God, when I was younger and I still had a dad, we would discuss things theological and philosophical quite a bit. And one of the things that we were always looking into or asking was, what's it all for? Look, the world around, why did God do this? Why do things exist? What's the purpose? What does God need out of creating? And so at some point, an atheist answered that question for me. It was, his name, Justin Schieber, yes. Justin Schieber, who used to work on the Reasonable Doubts podcast, which was eventually taken over by Benjamin Watkins. At any rate, he had this sort of unique idea that he called he called it God world, or the problem of non-God objects. And basically he said that something to the effect that, the very act of creating means that God needed something, outside of himself. And so the world, if God desires a perfect world, the perfect world would be a world that contains only God, because God is perfect. The moment that God creates a thing that external to himself, he creates a world which is less than perfect. Even without sin or anything, every object that exists external to God is less than absolute, and therefore there are flawed or non-absolute objects.
Why think that's the case, though?
Well, I'm not saying that's the case. That's Schieber's
No, I know.
argument,
No, that's what. Yeah, that's what I was asking if he addresses that at all.
Well,
does he justify his claim that if God creates something external to himself, that thing would not be perfect?
It would be less than absolute, is his claim. Why? Okay. A world with just God is a perfect world. When you create less than absolute objects, limited objects with limited space and capacity and characteristics, then you've created a world which has limitations versus a world just containing God.
Okay. In that case, I would want to know how he's using the word perfect, because it sounds like he might be equivocating on the term perfect.
This is actually a good topic for an episode in the future. So, because I think there's a lot of rabbit trails or rabbit holes, I should say, we could dive down on this one. But the way I took it was the fact that if God had not created, he would be static. He would not be dynamic, because he would be unacting. It's sort of the second law of thermodynamics, that to act is to act on something external to oneself. to act is to react. And then you could take that to the Aristotelian idea of the unmoved mover, that all things that currently move had to have some kind of origin in something that is unchanging. But my point is that prior to the work of Christ, there existed this thing within God's nature where he had what appears to be a paradox, both the justice and the forgiveness. The work of Christ allowed him to resolve this seeming paradox in his nature, and by doing so, he was fully actualized. He was a being who had no contradictions because of the work of Christ. Without the work of Christ, that issue is not resolved. And so the entire story of creation from beginning to end is the story of Christ's work, which occurred to resolve what would otherwise be an unresolvable facet of God's nature. And that's why my perspective is that, that God, first of all, creation is an eternal act of God. And second of all, that God is simultaneous in all points of time, because if that were not the case, there would be a period of time in which that was not resolved.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I see that.
Versus God being omnipresent throughout time and space, and creation being an eternal act, meaning that the work of Christ is eternal. For us, it happened in a point in time, but because it happened in a point of time and God is timeless, that was never not resolved within God's nature.
All right.
Yeah, that might be one for a future show. Because I definitely want to watch his video or read his article or whatever he did to defend it before we were to talk about it, because he's using a lot of terms there, which I really need to know how he's using them in order to be able to interact with his argument.
Yeah, it's interesting. What the most amusing part of that to me, I actually spent a lot of time writing and thinking on the God world argument that he originated. But the amusing part to me was that he originally presented this in a conference of sort of atheists, academics. And so he gives this entire sort of philosophical, theological argument against God, sort of an internal critique. And at the end of which they're like, why are you talking about theology and philosophy? This is, they really criticized him for, talking about philosophy and theology when such things were below them and unnecessary and just fictions, So
wow.
Why?
I'd love to hear them say something like that to Michael Tooley, one of the smartest atheists alive today. Speaking of which, did you hear that Kai Nielsen passed away a few days ago?
Oh.
Didn't.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, and just after we lost another big atheist intellectual philosopher too, Kai Nielsen, and who was it? I'm blanking on who. I forget who the other one was, but Kai Nielsen passed away a few days ago, and then another really powerhouse in atheist philosophy passed away a little while ago too.
Is Graham Opie okay?
Oh, Graham Opie, actually, I think that was him who passed away.
Really? He passed away?
I believe so. Let me double check on that real quick.
Dead air. You're listening to the Mentionables.
Yeah, no, keep going. I want to look this up real quick.
We'll just do this for a minute.
Yep. And for those listening on the podcast later on, this is what you miss when you don't tune in live.
Yeah, you just missed fact check flashing up on the screen. So
right. Really crucial points of this podcast /
absolutely. Yeah, I think we're reaching the end of the broadcast.
Yeah,
okay.
We've gotten there.
Yeah. Okay. So so Kai Nielsen passed away April 7th. So that was 3 days ago. And then let me double check. Well, no, it looks like Grandmappy is still alive according to Wikipedia. Who was it?
Let's figure that out later and make a post on the.
If one of our listeners
discussion.
If one of our listeners remembers who it was, they can post it in the comments too. So
there we go. That's perfect.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, let's have Joel. Let's start with you. Tell people where they can find your content.
I'm just going to go ahead and say joelfurchess.com.
All right, Clinton.
Simple way to go.
Yeah, well, of course, you can find me on social media, and you can find my podcast, Pro-Life Thinking, at the blogtalkradio.com/pro-life thinking website, and you can find it on iTunes. I interviewed Fuzz Rana on the topic of transhumanism. You can find our discussion there. And I'm also on YouTube with the Pro-Life Thinking YouTube channel, where I do a broadcast where I rip the audio from the broadcast and put it on the audio-only podcast. But I have videos planned that are going to be unique to the YouTube channel. So if you want to get the most out of the pro-life training I offer on Pro-Life Thinking, you'll want to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you'll want to listen to our audio-only podcast as well.
And you can find that in the Mentionables list of various channels that we have. If you go to our main page on YouTube, it is listed there. So it's a quick, easy way for people to find it.
Yeah.
So I also work with Question Christianity on YouTube, Facebook, all that good stuff. So, but the reason why you're here is because you're listening to the Mentionables. And if you find this kind of stuff good and these kind of nerdcast beneficial in terms of touching on everything nerdy while we dive into these deeper philosophical, theological issues of apologetics, then
I was going to say this one got really philosophical.
It did.
More so than most.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. Good topic for discussion.
Yeah. So if you enjoyed this, hit subscribe, hit notifications, give us a like. All that stuff helps with algorithm stuff. So, hit us up with that.
Give the video a thumbs up too, because that really helps to feed the algorithm.
Or a thumbs down. Thumbs down may help as well. So, any attention is good attention in my book. So, So that's it. If you have suggestions for a upcoming episode, thoughts, comments, questions about this episode, be sure to put them in chat. We'd love to interact with some of those. Okay. So that's it. Keep on listening. Keep on mentioning. I should have our outro ready when I do that.